Let me begin by firstly congratulating all of you who have stayed for the very last session. You're heroes. Let me also begin by thanking Octavio and Doris and Louisa and Alexa and Monica for being such a fantastic MC throughout this conference. This has been a wonderful experience for all of us. I think because I'm speaking at the last section, I can speak on behalf of all of the speakers. It's been a fantastic experience for us, and thank you very much for inviting us to beautiful Medellin. Now, it's very important that you understand the words that I'm going to use now. I've titled this presentation Digital Literacies, and that's a term that we've been using for 2 days, but I'm using something that is familiar to you in some ways, but not in others. I'm talking about digital literacies in the age of curation. And possibly the best way to understand what I mean by the age of curation is to say that until recently, we lived in the age of gatekeeping. That we had people such as the gatekeepers of information. So we have editors of newspapers in particular, people who run television stations. They have been the gatekeepers that have decided what information we will have access to, what we will know and what we don't know, what we won't know about. They have made decisions, they have made selections for us. They have acted as gatekeepers, and we have trusted them and given them power. Today, I'm arguing that a new word that we have to take a lot of notice of is curation. Now, this is a word that we all know in the context of museum studies and galleries. When we go to an art gallery, the exhibition has been curated for us. Paintings, sculptures have been chosen to be put in the exhibition by experts, and they are curators. Now, I wanted to tell you now about a word that is being used a lot in the context of the internet, and that is curation. And the story I want to present this afternoon is how we have moved from the notion of curation in art and in museums to curation on the internet. And of course, the point I'm trying to make today is that this has very serious implications for us as educators. So now I can begin the formal presentation. This is going to be lots and lots of beautiful pictures because this is the last session. I think Octavio must have known, I don't know if he's here, that this session, my presentation might be suitable for the last session because it's full of beautiful pictures. This is a picture of the art gallery of South Australia. I spend a lot of my time going to festivals, arts festivals in Australia, because there are many. Every city has a national an arts festival once a year. So in March this year, I went to the Adelaide Festival of Arts, and the feature at that exhibition was an exhibition of the works of Turner. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Turner, a very famous British artist. Now, the exhibition, and I'm obviously going to be concentrating on curation, the exhibition comprised over 100 works, oil paintings, watercolours and sketches, some of which had never been exhibited before. Now, this Turner exhibition, and that's a self-portrait of Turner, was co-curated, and I got this information, was co-curated by Ian Worrell of the Tate London, that's where most of the paintings came from, and Jane Messenger of the Art Gallery of South Australia. Now, the most notable feature of the curation of this exhibition was what I would call its conservatism. The exhibition traced Turner's trajectory from his boyhood to his death, a chronological survey showing his evolution from a precocious 13-year-old to a great painter of nature's light, colour and atmosphere. Now, this work, Disaster at Sea, was a very important and good choice to show in Australia. Now, this painting, which was painted in 1833, captures the shipwreck of a convict vessel bound for Botany Bay, Australia. You know that Australia, the Aborigines were the first people in Australia, but the first settlers in Australia were convicts. The British came to Australia and they brought prisoners with them. Now, all 125 women and children on board were lost in a violent storm off the coast of France. And an inquiry established that the captain didn't lower his lifeboats, and he refused help from the French Coast Guard, claiming that he wasn't authorised to land his cargo until its destination. And what you see here in this painting is people drowning, horrible death at sea, women and children, terrible, terrible situation. And this painting was a wonderful choice for an exhibition in a former British colony, and you in Columbia know what it is to be a former colony, that resonates very strongly with contemporary politics in Australia, with all of the refugees that have come to Australia from war-torn countries such as Iraq and Afghanistan, and hundreds of refugees trying to reach Australia have drowned at sea. So this painting had great significance in this exhibition. Now, in each room in the exhibition in the South Australian Gallery, there were wall texts, and that's what you're used to in an exhibition, with contextual information about Tern and his life. And there were also those big boards in each room explaining more, giving you more information. So the curation was traditional, conservative. It was unobtrusive, predictable and familiar. It was comfortable, very comfortable curation. Okay, in December last year, that's in 2012, I went to Sydney, to the Gallery of New South Wales, and I caught up with the Francis Bacon exhibition. Now, this was 5 decades of Francis Bacon, a very famous British artist, a gay artist who is probably one of Britain's most famous artists. Now, this exhibition was curated by a British man, Anthony Bond, and he describes Bacon as a towering figure of 20th century art whose paintings are gutsy, controversial, and unforgettable. So there were 50 paintings covering the 5 decades of his career, from the shocking works of the 1940s to the more exuberantly coloured and visceral paintings of the 70s and 80s. Now, shown alongside the paintings was a wealth of archival material, and these examples of materials included photographs of friends, pages from magazines, art journals, newspapers, film posters, all of the things that Bacon surrounded himself with. And they were called the resources. And he said he liked to work in chaos. Now, like the Turner exhibition, the Bacon exhibition also used chronology to sequence the paintings decade by decade. There were resources in glass cabinets. There was a video which talked about the curation of the exhibition and how they had made choices about what to include and what not to include and how to present them. Okay, now back to Melbourne. This is when you come to Melbourne, because I'm sure you'll all want to visit Melbourne, there's a wonderful modern art museum called the Heidi Gallery, and in March this year I visited to see an exhibition of the work of Louise Bourgeois, a very famous French-American artist, and that's a part of the museum. This exhibition was curated by Jason Smith, and it had over 20 works which focused on the final 15 years of her career. And it looked at her use of fabric in sculpture and drawing. So she was a very inventive, provocative and influential artist. Now, her biographical story, I just saw this recently in New York, which was, this sculpture had been moved. Her biographical stories provided inspiration for her work, her parents' tapestry shop, where she learned the value of art as a form of reparation, her father's infidelity, her mother's betrayal, early death, sense of abandonment, all of these things that you see in that are represented in her art. Now, Take note particularly of this piece of Louise Bourgeois, because in this exhibition, the curator's intervention in shaping the meanings was more evident than with the Turner, and there were very deeply psychological explanations of the exhibition. Now, the associated exhibition, and that was in the old house at Heidi, was curated by an Australian curator, Linda Michael, and it showed the focus of the Australian exhibition was Australian artists who the curator believed had been influenced by Louise Bourgeois. This is the old house, and inside, see, this is a piece by an Australian artist, and you can see the direct influence of Louise Bourgeois. So the exhibition looked at the relationships, both real and imagined, between Louise Bourgeois and the Australian artists. And next I go to the Adelaide Festival. The Adelaide Festival, back again, and this was an exhibition of art by the New York artist. I think you're probably familiar. This is the gallery in South Australia where the exhibition was held, and I'm sure you're familiar with the work. I'm not sure, but maybe if you're not, you should have a look at her stuff with Laurie Anderson, the New York artist who also calls herself a curator these days. She's a composer, an artist, and makes installations. And Laurie Anderson worked with the curators in Adelaide. Together with them, she collaborated with them for the exhibition that was shown in Adelaide. Now, what you see here is one of the installations, and that looks like a hologram. It wasn't actually a hologram. It was little models in which they projected images of Laurie Anderson and her dog Lolabelle. And this just kind of grabbed me by the throat, this particular one, because you hear Laurie Anderson's voice. And the point about the exhibition of Laurie Anderson in South Australia was that her presence was everywhere. There were voice recordings, audios of her voice. You saw this hologram of her. You had very touching stories about her relationship with Lolabelle, who's now dead, and how she travelled across America with her dog Lolabelle. Laurie Anderson wasn't actually there, but her presence was there. So that was a collaborative curation success. And I have to show you this in case you, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Lou Reed, a very famous composer, and he and Laurie Anderson are partners. So the point here is that the degree of intervention in each of these exhibitions was very different. Degree of intervention of the curators was very, very different. In the Turner, the Bacon and the Bourgeois, there are curatorial statements presented as wall texts. With the Anderson, I had to make a phone call to Adelaide to find out about the curation because that information wasn't provided. For the style of curation varied. For Turner and Bourgeois, it was discreet. For Bacon, it was overt, omnipresent. They had a video about how they curated the exhibition. And for Anderson, she was everywhere. Her presence was there in the gallery. Now, that term curation has been used for centuries in the context of museums. Now, it's used on the internet. And in particular, and this is just the beginning of my work doing some research in this area, in particular, I've noticed that the word curation, and I'm sure when you finish, I hope that you will look up the word curation on the internet or using Google and see what you can find on the internet. I've found that it's particularly present in the fields of marketing, in online communication, the discipline of education, and also in literacy studies. Now, this guy is Elliot von Buskirk. Now, he was a writer for Wired, the magazine, the magazine of the age of the internet. He's no longer a magazine, he's now a writer for Wired, but now he's an editor. And he said, he was the one who announced, we have arrived at the age of curation. And he says that in this digital age of excess, of information excess, we're surrounded by too much music, too much software, too many websites, too many feeds, too many people, too many opinions, and so on. And he said that curation is fundamental to the way in which we view the world these days. Facebook curates the web. Evolver FM curates music. News publications such as the Huffington Post curate the news. And consumption devices such as Kindles and iPads, they curate functionality. Now, I think, as I think I've probably made clear already, I think that Buskirk was onto something very significant for us as users of the internet, but also for the students in our classes. So let me just say a few things about the genealogy, the origin of the word. Someone has already come up to me and said, am I using curation in the notion of healing? Yes, it does come from the Middle Ages, and yes, its original meaning was to heal. But then more recently, it moved into museum studies and gallery studies. But what I've been particularly interested in is been the movement in gallery studies since the 1990s, in which the curator has become a very significant person. That the curator, in many ways, it's become, in some situations, in postmodern kinds of terms, more important than the art itself. It's the curator who makes meaning, who makes sense, and writes very long articles and things that accompany the exhibition and talks about the meaning of the exhibition and what they've juxtaposed and the insights they're taking into the meaning of life and everything else. So that is what I've been interested in, looking at how those ideas about the importance of the curator from art studies, how we take that to the internet. So my questions have been, or are, what are the discourses and practices associated with curation in digital times, and what are the implications of these discourses and practices for us, for critical literacy education, which is what I talked about yesterday, but for education more broadly, but critical literacy education in particular. So I think that this word is something that we have to get our heads around. We have to understand what this means, because we no longer have those gatekeepers who we gave power to and authority to in the age before the age of the internet. Perhaps we can call it the age of gatekeeping. And now we are surrounded by all of this information, and lots of people are curating information for us. How do we now make our way through the internet, and how do we decide who we trust and who we don't trust? I can say something about what I mean by discourse analysis, but I think for last session on Friday afternoon, we can skip that one. Now, and in literacy studies, the same. I don't think I'm going to say, I've got a slide here about what I mean by practices, but the most important thing is that it's a socio-cultural activity. It's about knowledge, identity, all of those things. I'm looking at curation as a social practice. Now, some comments here about the application of curation in museum studies. I think I've probably said more than I want, enough about what I want to say about how it's being used in curation studies. So let's now move to the 4 fields that I said, that people writing about and acting out curation on the internet. And this is the field that we have to pay most attention to and take most notice of. And that is, and this is Emily, this is no comment on Emily's husband is a marketer and he works in marketing, and I'm sure she's going to see this as a direct attack on her family, but it's not. But I think marketing is something that we have to be very aware of, and because it's everywhere. When we use Facebook, we see marketing. Everything we do on the internet, we're surrounded by marketing. So the internet is often held up as a free source of information and services. And that's, when you think back to the original idea of the web from Berners-Lee in the mid-90s, that's how he saw it. And that's how words such as democracy are so often associated with the internet. But the marketers caught on very, very quickly about how they would exploit the internet to find new ways of selling us things and new ways of shaping the ways in which we think about their brands. So the internet brings infinite possibilities for profit making. So the presentation of interactive, customised marketing via digital channels, I think has changed the nature of communication from overt advertising, which is what we were used to in the age of gatekeeping, to individual news, and it's individual news for you, personalised for you, comment, word of mouth from trusted, credible, are they? And friends. That's the word of Web 2, all of our friends out there in internet land. Now, one of the exponents of marketing and how people who want to sell something can use the internet successfully for marketing is a man called Stephen Rosenbaum, and I'm going to talk a little bit about his ideas because I think that he's a very interesting guy. You can look him up on Google. He says that there are 3 main forms of content production, and see if this makes sense to you. 3 main forms of content production on the internet. Firstly, there's content creation. Secondly, content aggregation. And then the notion that we're not so familiar with, content curation. And all he argues, and this is his audience is marketers, people who want to make money out of the internet, he argues that all 3 forms can function independently of marketing forces, but the one with the most potential for marketers is content curation. Now, let me just talk about these. Content creation involves the development of newsworthy educational and entertainment material for distribution. Content creation includes creating a website, posting material to another website, and of course, one that's been talked about a lot today in various contexts is the prime iconic example of content creation is Wikipedia. Now, the next one, content aggregation, involves the automatic gathering of links. RSS is a family of web feeds used to publish frequently updated works such as blog entries, news headlines, audio and video. And this is the RSS channels for the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, content curation, and I used a slide of the Huffington Post yesterday because this is a phenomenon. If you're not aware of the Huffington Post, have a look at it online and also see if you can find out something about its history. You can look up Wikipedia to find out its history. It's a very, very interesting online phenomenon. This is an example of curation. Now, here's my first explanation of curation on the internet. Human filtering and organising. Human filtering and organising. So it's a relatively new practice in which people add their work to the work of the machine. So we know that there are algorithms doing all sorts of things with resources on the internet, but there's also the human input. And there's the Huffington Post. All 3 forms can involve marketing. With content creation, with content creation, you can see on Wikipedia for example, all of the academics who promote their own brand and themselves on Wikipedia. So you can also use Wikipedia for promotion. With content aggregation, and you just have to look at Google News and you'll see content aggregation, but again, the marketing there because there's that Google brand. But content creation has the most potential. And this is, there's Steve Rosenbaum in the bottom left-hand corner, and his book is called Curation Nation. Great title. Curation Nation, he uses a marketing discourse that's not immediately visible or recognisable, but he's telling you how people can organise, share and ultimately consume content, and he asks, who are the curators on the web? What can they gather and republish? What can they gather and republish? Do they have the right to get paid for curation? If so, who's adding the real value, the content makers or the curators? For curators, people who've spent their careers making content and trying to sort out an economic model, curation can seem like an end run around hard work. And so the conflict ultimately comes down to this. Is curation about saving money or about adding value? The answer, it appears, is yes to both. He says that we're living in an age of content abundance in which there are curators are inevitably going to mix their content with a blend of curated resources. So all of them are part of the value chain. Content curation is a hot topic amongst online marketers. It sparked polarised debate about content creators and content curators. And there's also raises all of the issues that I mentioned briefly yesterday about who owns the intellectual property. Is it okay, as the Huffington Post, before the Huffington Post attracted advertisers, the Huffington Post was simply taking articles from all of the famous newspapers, from the New York Times, from the Guardian, and republishing them. Did they have the right, did Huffington have the right to do that? Was she stealing somebody else's intellectual property? She got away with it, and now she is one of the most successful newspapers in the world. What are the ethics of all of these issues about curation? And as I was saying yesterday with critical digital literacy, the same applies to this. These are the issues that I think that we have to think about as educators, and these are the issues that I think it would be terrific if we can raise them in our classrooms to talk about with our students, so that they're not just moving around the internet thinking it's a neutral space where things just happen to get there, but thinking about asking questions about the Huffington Post. Did they pay the New York Times for the article that they republished? Is it ethical just to take an article from somewhere else? What are the intellectual property issues that we have to think about in the age of curation? Now to the second area I wanted to talk about, and that's online communication. Online communication is a field that began in the mid-1980s, and this is Mark Warschauer's kind of categorization of the periods, the main three periods of online communication. Actually, he talked about the first two periods, firstly in the 1980s, the beginning of computer-mediated communication, which began in the mid-80s. Then the web came, Berners-Lee invented the web in the mid-1990s, and then we all had access to the internet. And the third one, which Mark doesn't use, but I'm sure he would today, the article was a few years old, is the popularisation of the term Web 2 that was used in the first decade of this new century. So these three periods give us a handle about how to think about online communication and where curation fits into it. It's useful to talk about those three periods, so I've done that. And now I want to talk about social curation, which is what is happening on Web 2. Social curation. And that's when we create, organise, interpret and share pictures, video, music, opinions. We curate all that stuff. That's what we're doing on Facebook. That's what we're doing when we're using Web 2. The web, you could say that maybe, why is she making such a fuss about this word curate? I'm making such a fuss about this word curate because what I'm trying to say, what I am saying, is that we're living in a different time. We're not in the time of gatekeeping where we had trusted authorities that did this gatekeeping and selection for us. We're now in a situation where everybody's a curator. So how do we make sense of this new space? Now this example, this is an example of one of the many, many bits of software, new software around. This is curation software. It's called Scoop It. It's a pretty clever title, really, I suppose. Scoop IT, Scoop It. It's one of the many examples. Now, this is one of my favourite men, and it's a very small photo of him. I don't know Howard Rheingold, but if you don't know him, have a look. Every image of him on the internet, he's always wearing these ridiculous, brightly coloured jackets. But he's been a very important thinker. I think he's kind of like Emily was talking about the importance of Henry Jenkins. I think in many ways, Howard Rheingold is another one of those important thinkers about the internet. And he's very enthusiastic about curation. And this is what Howard Rheingold, who's a writer, a critic, an enthusiast, credited with, he coined the term virtual community. That was his word. And he is very hopeful about the internet and democracy and all of those positive things. And so if you want to talk about the those who have more utopian views about the power of the internet, for democratic change, have a look at Howard Rheingold, because he's a terrific writer. Okay, this is what he says about curation. An act of self-interest that enriches the commons, and that's a word that we've heard a bit of at this conference, that enriches the commons and benefits for everybody. I need to search, scan and select the best resources I can find for my own personal interests, and by making my choices available to others, I create a resource for many besides myself. Curation is also a signal to others who share my interests, people I probably would not have known or known about otherwise, who in turn suggest resources to me. I feed the networks of people who do me the honour of valuing my choices, and they feed me back. It's about knowing, learning, sharing, and teaching all in one. And this is, I hope that you're thinking about the kinds of things that all of the speakers over these 2 days have said. Emily being the most recent, who talked about co-work, working together, collaboration. This is just another form, and this is where a new word has been invented, well, not invented, certainly not invented, but a new word is being used for that kind of collaborative activity. But I started with the most important force that's using this word curation, and that's the marketers. The people, the educators, such as Howard Rheingold, are coming into talking about curation and its importance, but it's the marketers who've already taken over the space and have already started to exploit the territory. Now, Rheingold, he identifies what he says the responsibilities of us, that's all of us, in this area of curation. In a world, and this is the world that we live in, a world in which people are overwhelmed and inundated by information, young people need to learn how to scan, select, decide, and deploy information effectively, and know how to use information tools such as search, RSS, dashboards, pipes, and filters. And this is really another version of what Julie Coiro was talking about. But Rheingold does it in a much bigger picture kind of way. And he's aiming at democracy, which is, and Julie was saying, okay, you can all talk in that kind of way, but Julie says, right, how do we get down to the practice in the classroom? How do we actually do this as teachers? So I think that there's a great correlation between the kinds of things that Julie was saying and that Howard Rheingold is saying. Now, this is something that I hope that you will be able to identify. Social curation has also been described as a metaphor to live by. Now, Hugo Liu, that's the guy who just had the photo of, he works in the Media Lab at MIT, and he explains that Internet Y people, that's like him, not like me, use the term curation to mean the process of finding, filtering, and organising digital artefacts according to their tastes. So in real life, a curator is a vanguard of cultural heritage. Curators oversee museums and institutions. By talking about digital life as curation, we imply that it's an aesthetic project. I am the proprietor of the Museum of Me. I just love that. I think that that's got to be a title of a chapter of something that I write about, the Museum of Me. And if you've been worried about the children in your classes and about their use of Facebook and their concentration on themselves and looking inwards about themselves and their friends, this is something that perhaps you want to think about. He says, curating your online web presence is just a gateway drug. Trust me, it will spread to real life in a big way. The food we eat, the friends we keep, the habits of our day. And this is a word I know that from now on you will see the word curate everywhere. When you go to TripAdvisor, you will see references to curation. That's what TripAdvisor is doing for you in some ways. Okay, now we're on to the academics. They're not nearly as interesting, I think, as probably the marketers, but Mikko Villi, an academic in communication in Finland, he says, now this is the way curation is important in education itself. Social curation describes the network distribution of content by adding qualitative judgment and imbuing the content with personal and social significance. Social curation is about people distributing and marketing content in their networks by making personal referrals and guiding their peers to consume content that they consider interesting and relevant. He sees this as a network practice. Now, he regards social curators as knowledge brokers. So it's all the stuff that we've been thinking about and talking about, but it's just bringing in some new language and a new way, a new metaphor. That's maybe the best way to think about curation. As a new metaphor, we know how metaphors guide the ways in which we think and help us explain and make meaning of the world. So what I'm suggesting to you today is that perhaps the metaphor of curation is something that will be useful for us to think about the internet and those spaces and what we do with it and how we handle the deluge of information. Now, the ideological nature of social curation, I think, is evident, the ideological nature, and you know from what I've said so far that these are the things that really interest me in my work as an academic. Just look at this as this text that I've taken from the Social Curation Summit, a marketers' convention in Los Angeles. Now, this is what they're saying about curation. In the era of tweeting, liking, and Emily, how do I say that? +1ing? I meant to say plussing? How you share content is often just as important as the content itself. The conference is the must-attend event for anyone focused on the proliferation of visual social networks and the diverse array of content curation services that have drawn the attention of users, investors, and brands alike. Harnessing the power of social curation for marketing campaigns, product launches, promotions, events, and everyday projects is what the Social Curation Summit is all about. Now, what is absolutely important about marketing is that it is ubiquitous, it is everywhere, and it is something that we cannot avoid thinking about. Now to the third field of inquiry, and this is us, and that's education. Now, a common thread in education, in policy documents, and this is something that's been referred to in some of the slides over the past few days, are the skills for the 21st century. What skills do we need for the 21st century to make effective citizens in a global economy? Now, the Partnership for 21st Century Skills is an organisation sponsored by the Education Department in America and a consortium of corporations, including Apple, Cisco, and the National Education Association. And these are the skills that they say must be mastered by in the 21st century. Today's graduates need to be critical thinkers, problem solvers, and effective communicators who are proficient in both core subjects and new 21st century content and skills. These 21st century skills include learning and thinking skills, information and communications technology literacy skills, and life skills. 21st century skills are in demand for all students, no matter what their future plans, and they will have an enormous impact on students' prospects. Now, I'm mocking this just a little bit. It's important, and it's really covering the territory that all of us have talked about over the past few days. But there's something a little bit hyped up about this notion of 21st century skills and the language that's used to describe it. And language is evident in other key documents within the United States and also in Australia. I don't know if they're in Colombian education documents, whether you use the expression 21st century skills in your education documents in Colombia. Now, not that none of the policy documents that I've surveyed so far, that's mainly in America and Australia and England, have actually found the word curation. But there are many, many blogs and sites maintained by educators who draw attention to the connection between curation and 21st century skills. But there's a marketing kind of thing involved as well. So take a look at this example. This woman's called Barbara Bray. She describes herself as a creative learning strategist, and she works in California, and she makes connections between 21st century skills and curation on her website, and at the same time she promotes Scoop It, the software. So there's again that lack of neutrality there. She's promoting something, and she says, a curator pulls together and oversees collections of materials. The internet, Web 2 tools and social media have expanded the traditional role of publisher to almost anyone. The role of curator is changing too. Anyone can curate online material, pulling together their own collections. I started a new scoop it, collect your learning, and now I see why curating is important. So there's a kind of a lack of independence there. And that's the kind of thing that we have to be aware of when we're looking at who's talking about curation on the internet and what their purposes are. Okay, this guy's really a significant guy. If you want to have if you know George Siemens' work, some people are nodding. He's renowned as having invented the first MOOC, those multi-online, massive online learning experiences where, you know, that Harvard and all of the major institutions in America are having courses that involve hundreds of thousands of students, and they're moving towards giving those students proper accreditation for a fee. At the moment, these courses are free. But George Siemens is supposed to have devised the first MOOC in Canada. Now, this is what he says, and I think this is probably, if we're going to be talking about the educational importance of curation, it's his words that are probably the most significant. He says, a curatorial teacher acknowledges the autonomy of learners, yet understands the frustration of exploring unknown territories without a map. A curator is an expert learner. Instead of dispensing knowledge, he creates spaces in which knowledge can be created, explored, and connected. While curators understand their field very well, they don't adhere to traditional in-class teacher-centric power structures. A curator balances the freedom of individual learners with the thoughtful interpretation of the subject being explored. While learners are free to explore, they encounter displays, concepts, and artifacts representative of the discipline. Their freedom to explore is unbounded, but when they engage with subject matter, the key concepts of a discipline are transparently reflected through the curatorial actions of the teacher. So this Canadian academic is out saying, you, me, all of us, we are curators of our students' learning. That is our job. We are making choices and selections and decisions about the content and how that content is encountered in classrooms. Now to the last field I want to talk about, and that's literacy studies. John Potter, who's an academic at the Institute of Education in London, he's the only person in literacy studies that I've found in my survey of the field who's actually using the term curation, and he talks about digital media and learner identity as the new curatorship. That's a book that's based on his PhD thesis, and it was published in 2012, a very interesting book. He says that new digital media provide new contexts for making the self. So he's very interested in identity. And that's the research that he did with young people making videos about themselves and their lives and their identity. But there are connections here, of course, with Liu, that guy who talked about the museum of me, the notion of curation as a metaphor for the museum of me. Now, Rosenbaum, going back to the marketer, his notion of the curated me as a metaphor for millennials who have grown up with a 24/7 news cycle and reality television and who know the power of branding and publicity, this is what he says. This is what the students in our classes are doing. Every day they act as their own digital publicists, curating and monitoring the me brand. Now, with the impact of social media, many people have a profile of some sort. And as Potter explains, it's quite natural for those who choose and have the means to do so to share a mediated and curated version of their experience when they make, edit, present media texts of various kinds, from the online CV to the photo gallery, from the YouTube clip, whereas in earlier times we use words like written, edited, produced. It's quite clear that they are inadequate. And this is in his argument. In the context of the internet, those words that we've used in the context of the written text on paper, that those words are no longer adequate to describe what's happening on the internet. So that's why he thinks that the word curated is a useful word to help us explain the complexity of the literacy practices, the complexity of digital literacy practices. It subsumes all of those practices. So this is how he describes curatorship. He defines curatorship as an active cultural and literacy practice in new media with its own ways of reading and writing the self, its own lexis and grammar. Curating is not only about writing or curating, but also about collecting, distributing, assembling and disassembling. All of these activities are part of what people do in new media production, from posting a status in a social networking site through to making a short clip, sharing an online gallery, any other number of activities. It's about knowing how the different forms you are working with together work together to make meaning intertextually and for which purposes and audiences they are successful. So these borrowings have always been enacted across the arts. I talked about that book on yesterday, Remediation. There are borrowings from other fields, and this is what we're seeing here. Now I'm on the home run. Just a few more things to say before I finish. The term curation has moved from museum studies to the online spaces where it's used for the curated self on Facebook, iPod playlists and Flickr, and for what's a very common term on the internet, I don't know if you've come across it, curated consumption. In all the discourses associated with curation, traces of its use in museum studies are there, which suggests that the objects have been chosen and presented by an expert with the appropriate knowledge and experience. But is this always the case? That's the old meaning of curation, that there was this professional person who was trained in the field for many, many years and has authority. Now, everybody's using the word curation and everybody's doing it. So the point is the same point that I made yesterday. No matter the field of inquiry, the practice of curation is never neutral. As it's always ideological, there are, of course, implications for critical literacy education. As active participants in virtual worlds, young people develop their digital literacy practices through different online activities. They learn new social practices as well as applying and extending their existing knowledge to engage with online worlds. And it's important that we as educators engage with and understand what young people are doing in these spaces. Now, much of the way of the discourse, the way of talking about what goes on online is talking about producers and consumers. And I think that that's possibly, firstly, it's a binary and it sets up the producers and the consumers against each other, but all of the research has been done about what actually happens is that the vast majority of people who use the internet are not producers, they're consumers. The vast majority. No matter what we try and do in our classrooms, and we do produce content in our classrooms, it's mainly people consuming on the internet. So what I think might be a more useful way to think about what people do on the internet, I hate to say it, but I'm going back to the three categories presented by that king of marketers, Steve Rosenbaum, and he talks about content creators, content aggregators, and content curators. Maybe this is a useful framework for us to use to think about what's going on the internet and what we do with our students in our classrooms, rather than simply that binary of consumers and producers. The challenge for teachers. What is the challenge for teachers? How do we build understanding of the discourses of curation? And that's really what I've been talking about today. How people use the term curation on the internet, where it comes from, what its origins are, and how it's morphed into something quite different in the spaces of the internet. How do we build understandings amongst ourselves and with our students in our classrooms? How do we encourage our students to engage actively, creatively and critically with new media and with legacy media and with the print media in these changing times? And how do we encourage our students to engage actively, creatively and critically with all media in the age of curation?
La curaduría del contenido la ubicaría más hacia la web 3, como acciones en la web 3.0. Esa es la primera pregunta. Y la segunda pregunta es, ¿cómo cree usted que afecta esta acción de curar contenido con las leyes SOPA, ACTA y la ley Lleras acá en Colombia?
Okay. Colombian law, I'm going to leave. So, okay. But the first question about Web 2 and Web 3, my understanding of Web 3 is extremely limited. I understand that it's about semantics and that the computer's going to get, is it, the semantic web? And I don't really understand about Web 3.0, but I have talked a lot about the context of Web 2.0. In fact, that is really the context for me talking about curation and the importance of curation.
El micrófono por allí.
Nosotros los docentes vivimos muy pegados a veces a los modelos pedagógicos. Con estos nuevos cambios de la tecnología, la web 2.0, hemos encontrado que de pronto con la producción de los muchachos, con un Prezi, con un C++ o programas que permiten compartir y permiten retroalimentar su actuar en primaria o secundaria, pues han nacido algunas nuevas como ideas o teorías, como el conectivismo o el charismo. Eso como que nos permite construir un nuevo modelo pedagógico. En Estados Unidos se está hablando ya de ese tema en construcción colectiva de un nuevo modelo pedagógico. Gracias. Perdón, de Australia.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad, I was about to correct you, Australia. Do we think about a new pedagogical model? I guess that everything that I've said, I think would be part of that pedagogical model. I think that all four of us have been talking about the components of thinking differently about teaching in digital times, whether it's a coherent, total, comprehensive model for pedagogy. It's not, but what each of us, I think, has said over these 4 days, or not 4 of us, 5 of us, has said over these 2 days, what each of us has said over these 2 days is that we have to think about things differently. We have to become as familiar as we can with these new spaces, because we can't understand our students and the worlds that they live in and to deal with them in a way that's going to engage them in our classrooms if we don't understand the spaces in which they are living, and which we are living in too. It's not just them. All of us are living in these digital spaces. And pedagogical, it's not something, I think Julie has kind of talked about newness. It's not that we have to abandon the old tried ways of doing things. I think all of us have emphasised the importance of collaboration, about co-production with our students, about small group work, all of these things which are not new. They've been around, the whole of the 20th century, since John Dewey, about the best way for progressive education. What I think I'm emphasising is the context. I'm saying that the context has changed, that these new technologies are associated with new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking, new metaphors. If anything I leave you with today is to think about this new metaphor, a new way of thinking about these digital spaces, and that's curation.
¿Más preguntas? Allí. Caro, allí podemos llevar el micrófono.
Is that the same guy? Is that the same one? Is that the same guy?
La pregunta es sobre si los padres de familia entonces deberían de ser los principales curadores y cómo sería ese rol del padre de familia con respecto a la escuela. Gracias.
That's a wonderful question. I don't think that parents can ever be the main curators. They may want to be the main curators. We had this discussion over dinner last night, and Emily, I keep talking about Emily, has 2 very young children. She would love to be the curator of their lives, but maybe is for these few years while they're very young, but that's a ridiculous kind of ambition. because there's just no way that we can be the curators of our children's lives. We can provide models, we can provide guidelines, we can provide a home that promotes ethical values and ethical ways of seeing the world and civic participation and all of those things, but we can't curate our children's lives.
Vamos levantando la mano quienes tengan incluso más inquietudes y preguntas.
Bueno, estoy pensando en mis 44 estudiantes de sexto. Todos los exponentes en el simposio usaron enfáticamente el mapa mental como herramienta. Entonces la pregunta está relacionada con esa herramienta tan importante en la síntesis de un conocimiento específico, en cómo el estudiante, cuando es capaz de hacer un mapa mental, está presentando su elaboración específica sobre el tema de una forma muy resumida. Sin embargo, me cuestiono porque uno de mis 44 estudiantes tiene acceso a computador en casa. Y cuando construyen los mapas mentales, tienen la opción de hacer collages, de pegar, de pintar, de agregar fotografías, obviamente incluir texto, y esa posibilidad no la da, entre comillas, no la da la tecnología en cuanto a que si bien tiene muchísimos recursos para elaborar el mapa mental, me parece que sigue siendo para niños pequeños mucho más dinámico la elaboración de un mapa mental en forma manual, teniendo pues si se hace estrictamente desde la opción de mapa mental, incluyendo diversidad de formas de expresión.
Okay, well, what you've identified is something that's been raised several times during this symposium by members of the audience, and that is that there's enormous diversity of access to digital and computer resources in Colombia. And you've just described a classroom where only one of your students has access to technology. I guess that this is we're all, the five speakers have come from very privileged, relatively privileged contexts where access is far more widespread, has penetrated, and I think that I'm safe to say that this will eventually happen in Colombia as well, that this is the way the world is moving, some at a different pace in different countries. Whether one regime is better than the other, because I think you ended up by saying that you think that students, young people, children learn to make meaning and to understand the world and to form knowledge. It's better if they do this manually rather than with a computer. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that the reality is, and I think this is what David was arguing, the reality is that we are seeing a major shift in the world at a different pace in different countries, but we are certainly moving on a trajectory towards a digital world, and that it doesn't make sense to ask that question or to make that kind of comparison. What we need to do as educators is find ways to work within these new conditions, not to say that one is better than the other, because that doesn't seem to really move us anywhere. We're in new conditions. Perhaps it's going to take longer for your school than your classroom, than other classrooms perhaps in Medellin, but it eventually, I think it's inevitable. I mean, maybe, I don't know whether I'm being, I do think that these changes are inevitable, that they are ubiquitous, this is where the world is heading, and as educators, it is our responsibility to think about how we work within these new conditions.
del aprendizaje de los estudiantes. Nosotros. Me quedó sonando esa expresión. Hoy estamos aquí nosotros formándonos para liderar procesos en nuestras instituciones educativas. Por ese motivo estamos aquí. Nos vamos a ir con ese enorme compromiso. Y nos vamos a encontrar dependiendo de nuestra cultura, de nuestro contexto, que muchos no van a entenderlo, pero es nuestra tarea hacer que lo entiendan y que descubran lo que nosotros hemos descubierto hoy. Mi pregunta puntual es, ¿qué tipo de propuestas podemos llevar para que desde el currículo la comunicación en la vida escolar pueda abordar la incursión de nuestros estudiantes y maestros en el mundo digital? Estamos manejando mucha información y desde el currículo, ¿cómo vamos a proponer? ¿Qué cambios debemos hacer en nuestra forma de comunicarnos? Es decir, el maestro ya no puede decir eso no me toca a mí. Nosotros vivimos una cultura en que siempre queremos darle la responsabilidad a otros, es que eso no me toca a mí, pero sí nos toca, hay que asumirlo. ¿Cómo lo hacemos desde el currículo? Gracias.
That's a fantastic question. And I think that what's been good about these 2 days, I think, is that the 5 speakers have approached the big questions about digital media in different ways. I think that Julie, in particular, and Emily have focused very closely on classrooms and what can be done in classrooms. I can't talk, I don't want to say anything about what suggestions I could make for the curriculum, but I can make one very important suggestion for you as the educators who are going to go back to face these challenges. I think probably the biggest challenge is for you and us to find a language to talk about these things, to find a common language in which we can share understandings and share knowledge and find words that are going to be useful for us. That's really been my emphasis today. I'm saying that the old words perhaps are not so useful. The old words that we've used to shape and write our curriculum perhaps don't work in digital times. So we have to think about what are some possible new words that we can use successfully. And when we can talk together and use those words and develop a language that we share and understand and mutually understand, and use that language with our students and use that language with the Minister of Education as well, so that everybody is speaking a similar language, then perhaps we can talk about pedagogical change, how we can change the way we do things in classroom and with the curriculum.
Dos preguntas para que continúes hablando de Curation. Un niño o un joven de 14 años que pincha me gusta en Facebook, que comparte un enlace o que invita a sus amigos a un foro, está actuando como curador. Pero quizás ha puesto me gusta porque lo envió su amigo preferido, comparte un contenido de la chica o del chico que le gusta, al margen de la calidad de la información, ¿no? El niño no tiene la formación ni la capacidad que tienen los curadores de exposiciones, ¿no? Tenemos que formar a los chicos para eso. ¿Cómo? ¿No? Esta sería una pregunta. Y la segunda, la curación es un fenómeno que ocurre fuera de la escuela. ¿Los chicos pueden ser curadores dentro del aula? Gracias.
Okay, I'll take the first statement as a comment. I think that of all of the things that I said today, the notion that Liu used of the museum of me, curating yourself, the identity stuff, that's happening, and that's something that we're aware of, and I'm really just giving it another name, the curated me. Do our students, is it us, our responsibility? I can't remember. What was the second part of the question? The curation. Well, I think that as everything, that this is something, I don't want Facebook to come into the classroom necessarily, but I want discussions about Facebook and discussions about the Huffington Post and discussions about the lack of gatekeepers, the absence now on the web where everything is being curated by the same kinds of questions that Julie asked, I'm really losing it now because it's getting too late. Just the templates, the ways to approach critical thinking and critical evaluation. That's what we have to do in the context of curation. So that there's an awareness. There's an awareness among students that people are putting things together for you. They're making choices. They're including some things, omitting others, etc. So it's about making explicit the process and practice of curation in the classroom. I think it's enough.
Sí, la última pregunta. Adelante.
Funciona. ¿Sí funciona? Ah, bueno. ¿Qué piensa de la relación entre la curaduría y la presencia digital de un profesor? Porque un profesor ha sido, por tradición, un curador, por ejemplo, cuando escoge la bibliografía de un curso. Pero hoy en día son curadores en tiempo real, no solamente en un curso, sino incluso con intereses que superan el currículo del aula. Entonces, esa como primera pregunta, ¿qué piensa de esa relación entre la presencia online de un profesor que va haciendo curaduría en tiempo real de sus temas de clase?
Okay, let me go for that first. It's so late I can't remember two questions. Okay, just for that first question, you're right. And that is, I think, that the one way of understanding the term curation is to see the teacher as the curator of information and everything else. But that's really not my emphasis here today. My emphasis really is about the way the word is being used in other spaces beyond the classroom, on the internet. That's what I would like to raise your awareness of, much more than thinking about curation in the classroom. I think that it's a phenomenon on the internet. I know that as soon as I noticed the word, I saw it everywhere. I hope that when you go and Google, you will see the word everywhere. It's a practice that's big, and it is not necessarily people. We have always associated the term curation with professional skills, with somebody with authority. We respect the curator. That's from the context of the museum. But on the internet, many people are naming themselves as curators. This is what I think that we should be looking at critically and asking questions about. Yes, teachers are curators, but that's really not a new idea. I don't think I'm saying anything original there to say that that's what teachers do in their classrooms with curriculum. I'm talking about the spaces in which we live our lives. Let's have a look what's happening in those spaces and what the implications are for education.
Ya. Y la segunda, si apareció implícita en alguna parte de la presentación sobre la curaduría como un nuevo trabajo. O sea, que se pueda ver como un nuevo trabajo en el mediano plazo, un empleo. Una empresa necesita un curador de información. Pues, si está de acuerdo con esa línea, ¿quién se encargaría de ese tipo de formación, por ejemplo?
No, that's absolutely right, and that's exactly what I'm pointing your attention to. I'm trying to draw attention to exactly that phenomenon, that people are naming themselves as curators. Laurie Anderson, the artist who I saw with Lolabelle, her beautiful dog Lolabelle, the hologram, she calls herself as a curator. She calls herself a curator. If you go to music festivals, the music festivals are curated now. All music festivals are curated. This word is big. This word is everywhere. But let's just accept it and let it just kind of pass under our attention. Let's look at it and see how it's being used, because I think that it's a practice that we need to draw attention to.
Bueno, profe, muchas gracias por esta última ponencia. Para mí fue gratificante, en serio, esta actualización, ¿cierto? Me pareció muy interesante cuando mencionaste el libro de 21st Century Skills. Para mí ese libro es seguro obligatorio leerlo. Anoche fui a buscar sobre el término curaduría y creé un perfil en Scoopit. Agregué la aplicación en la barra y empecé a hacer este proceso, ¿cierto? Mi idea con este nuevo, para mí nueva idea, para mi nueva aplicación, es la enseñanza y el aprendizaje de vocabulario. Entonces fui y empecé a agregar entradas a un diccionario. Ahora reflexionando, mientras estabas haciendo la presentación, me di cuenta que hay un momento donde ese proceso de curaduría debe parar y tengo que volver a hacer un feedback sobre lo que guardé. O sea, esa es mi pregunta. ¿Cuál es el proceso a seguir después de la curaduría del contenido? Teniendo en cuenta que no me puedo pasar todo el tiempo haciéndole clic, add, y bueno, ¿cuál es el proceso a seguir?
Absolutely. And yeah, this, you've really summed up, I think, one of the major points that I wanted to make today, that I've tried to make today. And that is another synonym perhaps for curating is editing. And when I talked about we've moved from the age of gatekeeping to the age of curation, the age of gatekeeping, particularly in terms of information, gatekeeping information was dominated by editors. And as we know, newspapers are on decline, and how newspapers are going to reinvent themselves, we're just not sure. There's a big struggle going on at the moment. It's not that they all disappear, we're still going to have journalism, but what they do is there's editing, and there's decisions made about quality, and these are the kinds of things that we have to do as curators, and in the act of curation. And I think that's enough. Goodbye.
Un fuerte aplauso, por favor.